In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked behind manicured lawns and freshly painted fences, stood an old property that had weathered more than time. It belonged to a man named Aaron, who had lived there long before the HOA existed, before the board meetings, before the rules about mailbox colors and grass length. His land was larger than most, and at its center, an ancient stone well stood, the kind that seemed to hum with the rhythm of the earth beneath it. It had been dug generations ago by Aaron's grandfather, who believed that water drawn from that spot was blessed, clean, abundant, and alive. When the HOA took control of the neighborhood, everything changed. New rules were written. Old traditions were labeled non-compliant. The board, led by a woman named Carol, saw the well not as a heritage landmark but as an eyesore. Despite Aaron's protests, they decided that all open wells were unsafe and had to be sealed or removed. But for Aaron, the well wasn't just stone and water, it was the heart of his land. It had provided for his family through droughts, storms, and seasons when the city water had failed. It was sacred to him, even if the board saw it as a liability. As months passed, pressure mounted. The HOA sent letters, fines, and warnings. They claimed the well violated the uniformity standards of the neighborhood. The irony was that the HOA's own irrigation systems often broke down, leaving lawns dry and brown, while Aaron's garden always flourished, lush and green from the well's pure water. That alone sparked envy among some neighbors who whispered that his garden looked too perfect, that he was hoarding water while others struggled under restrictions. Soon, what began as envy turned into resentment. Then, one morning, while Aaron was away at work, the HOA made their move. A construction crew arrived, armed with machinery, citing an emergency safety compliance order. The men fenced off the property, dug up the stone well, and poured concrete over the opening. They left behind a flat slab of gray cement where generations of water had once flowed. When Aaron returned, all he could do was stare in silence. The life of his land had been suffocated. The birds that had once circled near the well were gone. The air felt still, unnaturally still. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed in strange, almost imperceptible ways. The grass that had once grown thick and green began to wither. The flowers that lined driveways lost their color. Even the ornamental trees seemed to droop, as though weighed down by unseen grief. Some homeowners blamed the heat. Others blamed poor soil. But Aaron knew better. The earth was mourning. The balance had been broken. Rain clouds gathered but passed without a drop. The HOA doubled down, installing sprinklers and enforcing watering schedules, but the water that flowed from their systems carried a sour, metallic taste. Even the pets refused to drink it. Meanwhile, the spot where the well had been sealed remained damp, as if the ground refused to accept its imprisonment. At night, Aaron would sometimes hear faint gurgling beneath the concrete, like the well was still alive, restless, and angry. A week later, the first true sign appeared. Carol, the HOA president, woke to find her backyard flooded, but not from rain. Water had erupted from beneath her patio, cracking tiles and flooding her garden. The source couldn't be traced. It was as if the earth itself had chosen her home as an outlet for something buried deep below. The HOA tried to dismiss it as a broken pipe, but the same thing happened the next day to another board member's yard, and then another. The water wasn't clear, it was murky, with a faint scent of soil and stone, like it had come from deep underground. Anything, he hadn't needed to. Nature was doing what it always did when pushed too far, reclaiming what was hers. By midweek, things escalated. The water began to rise in strange places, driveways, basements, even the pristine golf course near the edge of the community. It wasn't flooding in the usual sense, it was targeted, deliberate. Areas directly connected to the HOA board members seemed to suffer the most. Carol tried to rally her committee, but their meetings devolved into chaos. The sprinklers malfunctioned, spraying at odd hours, while underground irrigation lines burst with alarming frequency. Aaron stayed silent. He watched. He felt the pulse of the land shifting, as though the well's spirit was awakening beneath the surface. He could feel it in the air, in the subtle tremor of the ground beneath his feet. Every night, the gurgling grew louder, and the air thickened with humidity. The concrete over the well began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like veins. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, a low rumble passed through the neighborhood. Windows rattled. Car alarms went off. And from the sealed spot in Aaron's yard, a thin stream of water pushed through the cracks, glistening in the fading light. It was calm, almost peaceful, but it carried with it a silent promise, the beginning of something far greater. The HOA called in engineers and plumbers. They dug trenches, installed pumps, and tried to reroute the rising water. Nothing worked. Every attempt seemed to make things worse, as though the water resisted their interference. The board grew desperate, but their pride wouldn't let them admit defeat. They still saw this as a compliance issue, not a warning. Aaron, however, understood. The land wasn't broken, it was alive. And now that they had silenced its heart, it was speaking back in the only language it knew. The storm was coming, not from the sky, but from below. As the first real thunderstorm of the season gathered on the horizon, Aaron stood at his window, watching dark clouds roll in. The well's cracked surface shimmered with faint light from distant lightning flashes. The air smelled of rain and earth, but beneath it, something else lingered. A deep, ancient power stirring awake. The HOA still believed they were in control. But the ground beneath their perfectly painted fences and freshly paved sidewalks was ready to remind them just how powerless they really were. And as the first raindrops began to fall, the faint sound of rushing water echoed through the night, not from the storm above, but from deep below, where the spirit of the well waited, patient and furious. The storm that began that night marked the turning point. At first, it seemed like any ordinary downpour, heavy, relentless, drenching the manicured streets of the neighborhood. But to those who had lived there long enough, something about it felt different. The rain didn't fall in patterns dictated by clouds, it seemed to choose where to strike. Some homes remained strangely untouched, while others were battered by endless sheets of water. And among the soaked driveways and flooded lawns, one thing became undeniable: the houses belonging to the HOA board were suffering the most. By morning, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. The once perfect lawns were buried under thick mud, and the streets had become narrow rivers flowing in unpredictable paths. Sandbags appeared, pumps hummed, and residents panicked as their basements filled with murky water. But the oddest thing was that the flooding didn't follow logic. It wasn't the low-lying areas that were drowning, it was the very heart of the HOA district, where Carol and her committee had built their prideful homes. Aaron stood at his window, watching the chaos unfold. The rain poured, yet his own yard remained untouched. The well, though cracked and sealed beneath concrete, pulsed faintly with movement, almost as if breathing. The earth seemed to exhale under his feet, warm and alive. The power beneath the soil was awake now, and it was watching. Meanwhile, Carol was losing control. The HOA's emergency meeting was held in the flooded clubhouse, where members shouted over the noise of leaking ceilings. They blamed faulty infrastructure, old pipes, sabotage, anything but the truth. The engineers they hired claimed there was an underground spring forming beneath the neighborhood, but when they tried to map it, their instruments failed. Readings flickered wildly, showing pressure surges that moved like something alive. Then, came the sinkholes. One opened near the main entrance, swallowing a portion of the freshly paved street. Another tore through a board member's driveway, taking their car with it. It wasn't random, each sinkhole appeared in places where the HOA had dug, built, or buried something unnatural. Every violation of the land's original rhythm was being erased, one collapse at a time. The residents demanded answers. They wanted the HOA to act, to stop the flooding. But there was nothing human hands could do now. The pumps failed, the drains clogged with silt, and the city water supply was cut off due to contamination. The water wasn't just flooding, it was reclaiming. It carried with it bits of stone, clay, and deep minerals, as if the very bones of the earth were rising to the surface. Aaron became a ghost in their eyes. Some said he was cursed. Others whispered that he had cursed them. But he didn't speak. He spent his days walking the edges of his property, listening to the hum beneath the soil. It wasn't malice he felt, it was justice. Nature had endured the concrete and the steel for too long. Now, it was correcting the imbalance. At night, the neighborhood turned into a haunting reflection of its former self. Streetlights flickered through sheets of rain. Water trickled through cracks in garage doors. The HOA's neatly trimmed hedges lay flattened, drowned by their own irrigation systems. In some, Aaron became a ghost in their eyes. Some said he was cursed. Others whispered that he had cursed them. But he didn't speak. He spent his days walking the edges of his property, listening to the hum beneath the soil. It wasn't malice he felt, it was justice. Nature had endured the concrete and the steel for too long. Now, it was correcting the imbalance. At night, the neighborhood turned into a haunting reflection of its former self. Streetlights flickered through sheets of rain. Water trickled through cracks in garage doors. The HOA's neatly trimmed hedges lay flattened, drowned by their own irrigation systems. In some homes, the tap water ran brown. In others, it hissed and gurgled, as if something was pushing against the pipes from the other side. Carol tried to issue new rules. She demanded that residents stay calm, pay emergency fees, and assist with collective cleanup efforts. But fear had already taken root. Neighbors turned on each other. Accusations flew: who was responsible? Who had angered nature itself? A few whispered that the old well had been sacred, that sealing it had unleashed something buried beneath. By the fourth day of rain, the HOA clubhouse had become a shelter. Dozens of families huddled there, their power gone, their homes half submerged. The board scrambled to contact the city for aid, but every road leading out of the community was blocked, not by debris, but by water. Deep, swirling water that seemed to rise the moment anyone tried to leave. It was as though the neighborhood had become an island, isolated, trapped under the weight of its own arrogance. Then something extraordinary happened. Late that night, Aaron's land began to glow faintly, not with artificial light, but with the shimmer of phosphorescence reflecting in the floodwater. The cracks over the sealed well widened, and from within, a steady stream began to emerge. The water wasn't like the muddy flood that covered the rest of the town. It was clear, impossibly clear, and it flowed silently, curling around Aaron's garden like a protective barrier. The plants lifted, the soil softened, and the once dormant flowers began to bloom again despite the storm. The land had chosen sides. By dawn, the contrast was shocking. Aaron's property stood untouched, vibrant amid the chaos, while the rest of the HOA neighborhood drowned. It was as if the spirit of the well had remembered its caretaker, rewarding his respect with mercy while the rest faced retribution. The HOA's attempts to fight back became desperate. Carol hired a crew to dig into Aaron's land again, hoping to stop what she now called a rogue aquifer. But the moment they broke ground, the earth rebelled. The ground beneath their machinery liquefied, and the men barely escaped before their equipment was swallowed whole. The floodwater rose higher that night, creeping into Carol's home, swallowing the white picket fences she'd once bragged about in meetings. The more they resisted, the faster nature fought back. The HOA's irrigation pipes burst in sequence, like arteries snapping under pressure. Trees were uprooted and carried by currents that formed where no slope existed. The man-made order that had defined the neighborhood, the symmetry, the control, the pretense of perfection, was dissolving before their eyes. Inside her darkened house, Carol finally understood the truth. She stood by her window, staring at the swirling waters below, and realized that what they had done wasn't just bureaucratic overreach. It was desecration. They had silenced something ancient, something that had lived beneath their feet long before any of them had built fences or written rules. But the realization came too late. By the time the second week began, most of the HOA community had been evacuated. The city declared the area a disaster zone. The media called it a localized groundwater eruption. But those who had lived there knew better. They knew the land had risen in anger, that the well they'd stolen wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a connection, a living bridge between man and nature. Aaron stayed behind. His home remained untouched. Each night, he sat by the faintly glowing water that flowed once more from the cracks of the old well. It no longer seemed angry. It was calm now, alive and peaceful, as if satisfied that balance had been restored. Yet deep within, Aaron knew this wasn't the end. The land had awakened, and its message was clear: whenever man tried to dominate what he should protect, nature would always take back what was hers. As the rain began to fade and sunlight returned to the horizon, the neighborhood stood silent. The HOA was gone. The fences were gone. All that remained was water, endless, shimmering water, and the faint sound of the earth breathing again. But beneath that calm surface, far below where the well had once opened to the sky, something still moved, slow, steady, and watchful. Waiting for the next hand bold enough to seal it again, days turned into weeks, and the storm that had swallowed the neighborhood finally began to fade. The clouds thinned, the thunder softened, and for the first time in nearly a month, the morning sun broke through the mist. But the world it illuminated was no longer the same. Where there had once been rows of identical houses with trimmed lawns and white fences, now lay a vast wetland. The asphalt roads had fractured into islands of crumbled pavement, and trees jutted out from pools of standing water like survivors of a forgotten battle. The proud HOA community, with its bylaws, patrols, and polished perfection, had been erased. The city declared the land condemned. Officials tried to map the new waterways, but their equipment malfunctioned whenever they neared Aaron's property. The terrain had changed in ways that defied explanation. Some claimed it was due to shifting groundwater. Others spoke quietly about supernatural retribution. The media called it the Great Suburb Flood, but the people who had lived there knew the truth. The well had taken back what was stolen. Aaron remained. His home stood alone on the highest patch of dry land, untouched, serene, surrounded by the shimmering water that now filled the valley. His garden flourished brighter than ever, nourished by the same ancient water that had once run deep beneath the ground. Birds had returned, frogs croaked at dusk, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. It was a sanctuary now, not a house, a place where nature had chosen to begin again. In contrast, the former HOA board members had scattered. Some sold what remained of their ruined properties. Others moved far away, unwilling to speak about what happened. But for Carol, the former president, things didn't end so quietly. She had refused to leave, clinging to the ruins of her authority. She lived alone in what was left of her two-story home, surrounded by stagnant floodwater that never seemed to recede. The foundation had cracked, the roof sagged, and the walls bore stains of mold and mud. But the worst part wasn't what she could see, it was what she could hear. Every night, when the wind died and the world went still, she heard the sound of dripping water, slow, deliberate, echoing through the walls. Sometimes it came from beneath the floor. Other times, it trickled from the pipes though no faucets ran. She called plumbers, inspectors, even priests. No one could explain it. No one stayed long. And then, one night, as lightning rolled over the horizon again, she heard a new sound, a deep rumble, like distant thunder, coming from the ground beneath her house. The same vibration Aaron had once felt before the flood began. But this time, it was only under her. The water that had remained stagnant around her property began to ripple, gently at first, then violently, swirling in circles as if something was stirring below. By dawn, her house was gone. The city later claimed it had collapsed into a hidden sinkhole, swallowed whole. But Aaron knew better. The well had not forgiven. It had remembered. The land rested after that. The storm ceased completely. For the first time in years, the air carried peace instead of tension. Nature began its slow reclamation. Grasses sprouted through the cracks of old sidewalks, fish swam in the flooded streets, and wildflowers grew where cars once parked. What had once been a community obsessed with control became a sanctuary of balance, an accidental nature reserve born from arrogance and retribution. Aaron spent his days tending to his garden and listening to the rhythm of the water. He had learned to live with it, not above it. He knew now that the well's power wasn't a curse but a reminder: every drop of water, every inch of soil had memory. They carried the stories of those who respected them and those who didn't. Sometimes, hikers or curious locals would visit the edge of the abandoned neighborhood, drawn by rumors of the man whose garden survived the flood. They would see Aaron's home standing in perfect harmony amid a vast expanse of water and greenery. They often asked how he managed to save his land when everyone else lost theirs. He would smile, but never explain. Some truths were not meant to be spoken, only understood. Seasons passed. The wetlands became alive with life again. Herons nested where cul-de-sacs once stood. The air shimmered with dragonflies and reflected sunlight off the endless pools of it all. Beneath Aaron's garden, the well continued to breathe. It no longer raged, no longer surged in vengeance. It had become what it once was, a source of life, steady and eternal. But deep within, below the layers of stone and soil, something ancient still stirred. A consciousness older than man, older than rules, waiting patiently for balance to be broken again. And it would happen, someday. Humans always forgot. They built, they controlled, they dictated, always believing they owned the earth when, in truth, they merely borrowed it. For now, the land slept in peace. The water lay still. But when the next hand tried to silence it, when the next committee sought to cover what should flow free, the ground would remember. The storm would return. Because nature does not forgive, it restores. And those who try to rule her will always drown beneath her silence.